So now we are recording. Cool. I don't know if you want to introduce ourselves a little bit as well.
Probably.
Probably, yeah.
Start.
You want to start, or should I go first?
Why don't you go first?
Okay, I go first. Yeah. So this is me and Josh. We're going to do start recording videos on ReScript stuff. Like we haven't categorized it more than that. My name is Gabriel. Most of you who watch this probably know me. I spent some time working on various ReScript stuff, both the compiler and editor tooling and things like that. And I've also built and maintained a bunch of ReScript libraries, especially around GraphQL and Relay and stuff like that. And today we're going to look a little bit at RescriptRelay and the kind of ecosystem that exists around that. So Josh.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Josh. I'm been a web developer for about 10 years now, currently an engineering manager and like front-end architect. And writing JavaScript for 10 years. I'm always curious about ways to do things better. And I feel like ReScript has kind of come along at a great time and looks very promising. And I'm trying to dig into it as much as I possibly can.
Awesome. So we are going to look at the RescriptRelay starter repo. This is a fairly new thing, which tries to get you started quickly with ReScript and Relay and Vite, and also Tailwind and the dedicated router that we built for RescriptRelay. So we'll kind of have a look at a few different things here. Just going to try and start from the beginning, really. So we're not going to assume too much knowledge on either of these things. So in the repository itself, this is a starter repo, so it's pretty bare bones, but it does contain some code just to show you kind of how things work, how you get started writing routes for the router and those types of things. It runs on, for the demo purposes, it runs on a GraphQL example server I built a good while back. So this is started and running in the background, and it provides like a very basic schema and some updates, like some mutations and a few object types and a few queries and stuff like that. So it's a way of kind of pressure testing different clients, essentially. So this is I could also show our little sample app here. This is very beautiful, of course, full of styling. And it's essentially just a very small and simple application that has a few links and loads some data, essentially. So that's what we're going to be kind of hammering on.
All right.
Go back to the code. Excellent. Okay, so for those of you who hasn't heard about Relay or has heard very little about it, it's a client for GraphQL built by Facebook, and that powers Facebook.com and a bunch of other things. It's generally not that well known compared to things like Apollo or Urkel for various reasons that I don't think we should go into today because that'll be a long discussion, but still.
Yeah, there are other people who have covered that way better than I can, for sure.
Yes. So we'll leave that one out. But it's a very capable client. You could say that it's kind of what GraphQL was intended to be when it was first open sourced. Like Relay was open sourced, or the old version of Relay was open sourced together with GraphQL. And I think that the idea was that Facebook thought that people would be excited about Relay and wouldn't really care about GraphQL because it's just a protocol, essentially. And the complete opposite happened. Like people barely looked at Relay and jumped all over GraphQL. But Relay is a kind of a fully featured framework for building UI. So it solves a bunch of problems that you're normally going to encounter when you're building stuff. And it's quite opinionated, and it forces a certain structure into your app and a certain way of thinking. I've been building with it for I don't know how long, since it was open source, essentially. And for me, it's a very good way of thinking because it'll like kind of make you fall into the pit of success and make you build things that scale well and I like to think of it as you'll have constant pain when building with Relay. Like you start off, and it'll be pretty painful because you got to learn a bunch of things. But it'll also kind of stay that painful as you scale things. Whereas other solutions typically start off with zero pain, even feels good starting out and building things, and then kind of goes upwards as you encounter more and more advanced kind of things you need to do, and you start feeling more and more pain, and you start fighting the framework more. So Relay is more of a constant pain, and with a fair bit of complexity that I think is worth it, of course. So just looking at how things are set up and work, we have you remember the app I showed? It had a bit of layout and stuff. There's going to be quite a few different things to cover here conceptually. We have, of course, RescriptRelay itself and everything around that in GraphQL. But we also have the router, which is potentially one of the more important things to cover here because it powers the app, of course, but also enables Relay to kind of work in the best possible way for Relay, so to speak. Just going through the application here, how it looks. This is very very standard stuff. We have a bunch of contexts we set up. We have our context for RescriptRelay, which sends our environment. The environment is what Relay uses for making requests and keeping track of the cache and everything. So you usually pass that around when you're doing stuff. We have the provider, the context for the router itself, which I'm going to talk more about later. We have a suspense boundary. Everything in the router is and in RescriptRelay is powered by suspense. So that's it's very built with that in mind. So you're going to use suspense for loading states and everything around that. Also the same with error boundaries, which is both suspense and error boundaries are obviously a React thing. Both of those are a very big part of how Relay and the router works. We're also just from the router, you get a route renderer. And this is, you place this wherever you want to render the application driven by the router. Now, you can think of this in different ways. Like you could have a shell around this, which would be like styling, or if you wanted, or anything, or you can bake that type of layouting into the router itself. It's totally up to you. I usually bake it into the router itself because you probably end up in scenarios where you want radically different styling on different sections of the applications and those type of things. But yeah, this is all very, very standard stuff. The one thing we need to maybe talk about here is render pending. This little function here will render every time that the loading state of the router changes.
Okay.
And the loading state of the router changes whenever you're navigating between routes. There's a bunch of features in the router for like preloading things and stuff like that that will never trigger loading, but this will trigger whenever you're moving between routes. And the router is designed with suspense in mind, which means that it makes you stay on the previous route for as long as there's nothing to show on the new route, so to speak. So okay. Typically, if you don't use, there's a bunch of caveats, of course, but typically you'll see the old UI, and then as the new UI is ready, you'll go to that route. And in those scenarios, you really do need this pending indicator bar, which is a component that just renders a indicator bar up in the top, essentially.
Is that something that you just made for this, or is that like part of the router or anything?
It's something I just made for this, okay. But it's something so this is very simple. So you can see that it just shows the text. But it's something that you'll probably want to have in your application just because it's so convenient to be able to not have to think about loading states in your individual routes. Just have something centrally that's also powered by so the important thing here also is that you have a suspense boundary outside of the route renderer or on top of. And that's because the router itself doesn't have a suspense boundary by default. So this is what's going to, or it has one inside, but you could get suspensions outside of it as well. So you'll need this to catch if there are suspense things going on. Okay, so that's a little bit about the structure. As you can see, you don't really see many things here. Like if you want to see the layout and the structure of the applications, you're going to have a look at the router. And the router is a little bit like different to what's popular now. The router is, see here, the router is defined via a JSON file. And this is I'm going to explain like the rationale for everything. But this is, you define a JSON file with a list of routes. Every route has a path, of course. This is the root path. It'll match for /. It'll match for everything. Then it has a name. Every route must have a name. And then it has children. And this is the layout route, so it's not very fun to look at, but it includes another route file that we can jump to. And also notice that there's a bunch of tooling here. So there's a dedicated VS Code extension for the router, or it's built into the RescriptRelay VS Code extension. So you can see that you get kind of the full path that this will actually be then in the application, and you get the full name, and you get jump to definition and stuff. I'll show a bunch of things here.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
it's super helpful. That's awesome.
It's absolutely essential to be able to push this idea through that I have with the router, that it's not like that it's convenient enough, and for that we really do need like dedicated tooling. So going into the routes JSON file, I'll just go ahead and routes jump in here so we can see it. You can see that we have a single route here called to-dos that wraps a few other routes, or another route, the single to-do. And you can always see here what the path will be. This will be on /to-dos, even though you don't see the full / here either. Also notice that we have first-class support for query params. So you write query params just like you would in a URL, just with a ReScript type definition in here. And there's a bunch of cool things you can do with this later. I'll show you. But this then gets, you get these query params for this route, and then for all of the other routes, it's inherited down, just because it's going to be in the URL for all of the sub-routes as well. So you can see here that we're adding a path parameter here that you get up here, a to-do ID. And then we're adding an additional query parameter for the single to-do route. So this, just to drive the point home then, this single to-do route will get both statuses and show more as its query parameters, just because that's how the URLs work. And you also, with the children stuff here, this is nested layouts like you would be you're accustomed to from later versions of Next and Remix and stuff like that. So you'll have an easy way of creating layouts that don't get out of sync and that saves scroll positions and those types of things. So you could like define this whole thing as a single, like you wouldn't have to have any children. You could define it as a single flat structure here as well, but then you wouldn't get the nested layouts.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'll explain more when we get there. Yeah, let's see here a little bit. Like the router, when you define these routes, you'll need somewhere to render stuff as well. So for you, you'll get generated files that you have to fill in that do the rendering. So if we jump into this, for instance, you can hover this and you get to see like the full name and also the full path, and you can jump into the route renderer. You'll end up in this. Notice the name here, root to-do single route renderer. This is also located in a specific folder. This is a convention for the router to, for you to define your route renderers. These are the things that are responsible for rendering the route, but also for providing kind of structure to it all. So in here, this will be automatically code split, for instance, this whole file. So here in here, like the idea is that you take care of rendering here. And as you can see up here, you get this. There's a function that you need to call from your route. This is a file that's generated for you that has all of your routes nested, as you can see here. So you get a nice auto-completable structure when you want to interact with the route stuff. And you don't have to worry about this at all, because anytime you add a new route, you'll get these files generated for you in the right format. So you just have to fill them in, essentially. So rendering
just quick question: is the route generation, is that tied into like the relay compiler that's already running, or is there something else that's generating these?
Good question. There's a separate CLI for the router, but you don't have to worry about that because it's built into the Vite plugin. So as long as you enable the Vite plugin, which you have to have, so it'll run automatically.
Cool.
So you don't have to think about that.
Good. Cool.
So here's the thing that's a little bit different to how other routers work. You have 3 steps essentially when rendering a route. You see two steps here. I'll explain the third as well later on. But you have a prepare step that's responsible for kicking off whatever data fetching you want to do for a route, or whatever other things you want to do. This needs to be synchronous. So otherwise, you'd be accustomed to doing a async, like fetching data asynchronously and then waiting for it to finish before you render your route with that data. That's not how this router works, or how Relay wants things to work. This you instead, like, you start off data fetching as soon as you can, and then you get a token back from this. So this prepare function returns what this load function returns, which is a query reference. This query reference means that this query is potentially in flight, or potentially being fetched, or it's ready. We don't know. It's something that you use yourself later on to unwrap the data, kind of. So if we jump into this file, we pass this, we prepare this inside of the prepare step, and then we pass this into render. And we get this prepared. You can see that it's the query ref here. And then inside of the file, the single to do file, which is what's rendering this query, notice that this is called single to do query, and this is called single to do query underscore GraphQL. This file is generated for you by the Relay compiler, and it contains a bunch of things for using this query. We define the query in a module from this extension point, and stupid hover. And then we pass the query ref in, and we call a function called use preloaded here, and pass the query ref in there. And we get data from the query back, as you can see here. So what will happen in here is that when you enter this route, you'll start loading this query, but you'll immediately go down to rendering the route. So the query probably hasn't loaded data yet when you're actually in here first. So when this query ref hits use preloaded, Relay will have a look at it. Is the data ready? If it's ready, it'll give it to you here. So it appears synchronous. If it's not ready, it'll suspend. So you'll have a suspense boundary in the background that will catch this. So that's how it kind of can look synchronous, but still is asynchronous, so to speak. But these 2 steps are important to kind of remember that they work the way they do. Like, prepare is responsible for just preparing whatever you want, not finishing the preparation, just starting the preparation. And also, as you can see here, the prepare function gets our parameters from the route. If we jump into the route definition here, remember that we have statuses and we have show more. If we look here, we have show more, a Boolean, and we have, that's do ID. Sorry, we could bring out statuses here as well, I think. Yeah, exactly. Statuses, which is a array of to do status.t. So you get access to all of these things, fully type safe, in a way that you don't have to mess around yourself with converting back and forth. So this, for instance, this to do status, we jump into that file. It's a variant of completed or not completed. And you can see that it has a parse step and a serialize step. So the router will automatically call these to parse and serialize into your URL. So you can easily define and store virtually anything in the URL. But you never have to, as long as you write your parse and serialize functions, you never have to care about.
The parse and that serialize, those are things that the router is expecting to exist for statuses? Okay.
Yeah, for this type of, when you pass it a module, a type T from a module, essentially.
Okay, so it's connecting where that type T is coming from in that same module.
Yeah.
Or the parcel. Okay.
Yeah. So any like primitive available in ReScript, it knows how to serialize and unserialize that by itself. But anytime you have something that's not a primitive that it knows by itself, then you need to have a serialize and parse function essentially.
Okay.
The main idea behind this is that query params are really powerful and you should use them. You should put things in the URL. You should be encouraged to do that, to have state in the URL, because it's good for almost everything. It's good for being able to do deep links, and it's good for not having to kind of force state management when you don't need it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's usually very cumbersome to deal with query parameters. So the router kind of goes for making this as easy as possible. We'll see how we can use them via hooks as well. But just for now, just remember these things, that you get access to them in your prepare function. And you also have them here if you wanted to pass things along. You could pass along them as well to other things. So what we do here is we call the load function on this query, and that's what returns the query ref. We pass our environment, the relay environment. We pass a fetch policy, which just controls like how data is resolved via relay. So we say that either resolve this fully from the cache or resolve it via the network. And you can see that there are a bunch of other things, like only resolve it from the local cache, or resolve it from the local cache but always make an additional network request that'll update it, and network only, like never use the cache stuff, essentially. And then we pass in variables here. See if we get some runs on that. And you can see that we use our show more, but everything, this is a query parameter, and all query parameters are always optionals with the router, just because you don't know if they will exist, because we're not matching on the query parameters themselves. If you want things that you need to be guaranteed that they exist, you have to handle it yourself here, essentially, or use a path parameter. So we need to unwrap this with the false here. Any questions about that? I felt like that was a lot of.
No, this all makes sense so far. Like,
good.
Good. I think I'm good so far.
Good.
So far, I'm with you. One question I think I have, though, is that it seems like there's a lot of connection from the top all the way down to the bottom, and then the bottom all the way back up to the top. Where do you start?
Do you start like when you work with the router, or?
Yeah, like if I'm going to make that to-do page, am I writing that query first, and then from there, am I working back? Because it seems like I can't actually see anything on it seems like a normal pattern that a lot of React devs have, right? Is like you make a page with nothing on it, you get your data, you render a JSON blob until the data looks like how you want, and then you turn it into content. This seems like you kind of have to know the shape. Like it's almost like you have to start from thinking about your data first, and then the visuals and the page and the routing, right? It's like kind of working from I define my query, then I define the route based on that query. And then once I'm on that page, then I have the data from that query, and now I can do something, which is good. I like that. I think that's fine. It's just different than how I think I see a lot of devs working.
So multiple answers to that, I guess. You could, like, what I'm showing now is the most like optimal way to do things from a performance perspective. So structuring things like this will ensure that we have one trick left that I haven't shown, and that is lazy loading the code for the route as well. So lazy loading this component. And doing that will allow you to load the data and code in parallel, and that'll be as performant as it can be, essentially. So that's one part of why it's structured this way. But and then also like looking at this, of course, like GraphQL and ReScript by itself, since it's nominal and it's structured in a certain way, the data, you will kind of be forced to work from the data and back. What I typically do when I work with the router and RescriptRelay is I usually think about the URL structure first, so I set that up. But then it's usually a matter of I usually know what type of thing I'm implementing. So it's usually fairly simple to start with defining the query and stuff. We get much further into how Relay wants you to structure things. As you can see here, we have a fragment spread already and arguments and stuff. So I'll show that as well. But I think that GraphQL and ReScript kind of naturally leans towards you plotting out the data a little bit first. But you could like, you wouldn't have to do this. Like, you wouldn't have to preload in the router if you wanted to. You could just, there's a use hook as well here, which where you could then add the variables yourself in here, essentially. And that's lazy loaded then, which is typically like less performant and less good.
Right.
But you could do it this way if you don't want to hook up the router stuff.
And with the router, is there a way for me to just manually point to something without having a, like, does every route require there to be a query, or can I also route?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can do whatever you want, essentially.
Okay.
So you jump into the here, go into this one. Then like you could render just, you could even, I'm not sure if you can remove the, you can't remove the prepare step, but you can just have it return unit, essentially. And
gotcha. Okay.
And then do whatever you want in here.
Okay, cool.
So you don't have to have you don't have to load stuff here if you don't want to. There's like a fair bit of, I think we have a let's see here, to-dos route. Oh no, let's go back to here, check this one out. Oh, this does load data as well. Otherwise, like typically you have layout routes and they don't usually kind of load data.
Gotcha. Okay. So you can just basically start by define a route. I can just make an empty prepare step. I don't have to do anything there yet. Render is going to map it to the actual component that's used on that page. And then I can go in there and I can start just defining my query. I can lazy load it at first, just using use. And then as I am ready to actually wrap up and make it a real thing, like productionalize it, then I can go through and pass the data back and enhance that prepare step to make it do everything that I want it to do in the fastest way possible. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
So
cool. Just wondering.
And you could theoretically use this router, of course, without any relay stuff at all. It's just that it's optimized for relay, because what relay wants you to do is exactly what we did here, which is that as soon as possible, start loading this data. But you don't have to wait for anything before you start to load your UI. So you're fetching data at the same time as you're rendering UI. And this has a bunch of consequences that we won't have time for today, but I can show later on, which is that Relay can render your view even if you're requesting data that it doesn't have any cache. It can render as much as possible of your view with old data, essentially. So
because it keeps track of like partial data and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So as long as the store can reach data in the cache without hitting something that it needs from the server, it can just go ahead and render your application. So that's very useful and something I use a lot, because it means it's very easy to build kind of your app shell. You never have to wait for data to be able to render your app shell, even if you have stuff in your menu or stuff in your footer or header or whatever that needs things from the server. If you just design your queries and your fragments in a certain way, which isn't very hard, it's very natural to how Relay works, then you can render as much as possible statically and then have things pop in as they kind of reach you, essentially. Which is very useful. Now we're looking at the to-do list instead, and that's the thing that kind of wraps the list of to-dos that we had. If we look at here, you can see that. Let's see if I can go into this as well. Test. Yeah, exactly. This is under the to-dos route. So if we go to, it's a terrible UI to show this, but still, this is a link. If we go into this, we get a list of the to-dos available. So that's where we are now in the to-do list. One neat thing that I'm going to show you that's in the tooling is we can copy this URL, and then we can jump into the code again, and we can call a command from the extension, find routes from URL. And if we pass this in, it'll show me that these are all the routes that
is nice. That is
available
really cool.
That is useful when you're deep into something and trying to figure out where you're actually at.
Yeah, like that is super helpful.
So from here, you can jump into either the route definition, which is this one, or you can jump into the render, which is this one.
Nice.
And there's also another thing that can be quite useful, and that is this isn't very useful here, but you can see here referenced in one route. It tells you all of the how many routes your component is referenced in. So this is the obviously the component for this specific route, so it's only going to be referenced in one. But I'm not sure if we have something that's referenced in several routes. It'll do this for every single component you have. So let's see if we find. Yeah, we don't have any other. But in other applications I work, like this number could easily be like referenced in 200 routes or something like that. So that's quite neat. So that's also one part of the tooling. So like that's the kind of leading with the router stuff, which is may or may not be very intuitive, but still that's the foundation of this example. Like obviously you can use RescriptRelay without this router. Like you don't have to use it if you're using a framework like Next or something else. Then you're probably not going to be using it because it doesn't integrate. Its own thing. But I personally really like having something dedicated to Relay because you'll get performance automatically. And I'm also not a framework guy. I don't enjoy, or it depends on the framework, of course, but I don't enjoy using Next or Remix or the other things. Like they are wonderful at what they do. It's just not very much for me. I always end up fighting the framework. So
they're great if you do things exactly the way they want you to.
Yeah. And they're like they are very good developers who build those things, so they are constantly expanding what they can do and what the happy paths will be. But I've just throughout my career found myself more often than I'd like to just fighting the frameworks and spending a lot of time just fighting the frameworks. So I'm kind of at a stage where I'd rather have kind of an open hood. I can tinker with things as I like. I can build my own plugins or shuffle things around, and I understand how everything works, and that's. I believe that saves me time over time, even though I have to reinvent a couple of things. Still, like I've lived through so many situations and where I have to spend so much time just fighting the framework, and that time adds up as well. So the frameworks are great. That's not what I'm saying. It's just for me, it's I like having more control, I guess. So that's a bit about the router. It has a bunch of other things. Like I'm not sure if this is a very minimal example, but it has a ton of conveniences for working with the URL and the routes and preloading stuff. I think we can maybe have a look at. Oh, we don't have a. Do we have a link somewhere here? Relayrouter.link exactly. Yeah, we should mention this as well. Here we're in the to-do list item. Which is the single, like the single each listing of the to-do list. But one of the main benefits of the router that I should probably mention is that it has a type-safe route creation layer. So whenever you want to create a link to somewhere in the app, you go through routes. This is a file that's generated for you every time the router updates. And then you can walk your way through your route structure into to-dos. Each level of route will have a route file, like you can see here, which is for this particular route. Like this obviously has a child route as well called single. But if you want to link to this specific route instead, you could do that from here. Then walk into single, and then the route. And then you have a bunch of helpers here that you can use. And one of those are make link. And this will ask for everything that's needed to construct a link to this page in a type-safe way. So notice, for instance, that statuses, it's still your to-do status. And show more is a Boolean and those types of things. So, and this will, like, you don't have to, the point of this is that you don't have to think about your URL structure when you're doing day-to-day stuff.
And so if that route ever changes, or you would know.
Yeah, you would know, and you will never create a link that doesn't work in this type of application, because it's always this returns a new string, and of course that you pass into two, but still, like, there's just no way to unless you're writing it by hand to create a link that doesn't work. And the important thing here is that you think about routes by name. You don't think about routes by URL structure, which is far more efficient in the long run, because what you really want to do is you want to link to a single to-do. You don't want to link to /to-do/ID. Like, that's not really what you're conceptually after. So as your application grows and you want to route to different parts of your application, it's going to be much easier to kind of, like, this is obviously a bad example because there are so few routes. But I have apps with many routes. And whenever you want to link to somewhere, you don't have to work your way backwards and go and figure out what the URL is, what parameters it has in what positions, and what query parameters it has, and how to encode and decode. You just follow the autocomplete to whatever route it is you're going to use. Make link, and
which is great.
So you could so you're interacting with everything just the way you'd expect. And then when you link like this, and you render from this route, then you'll also have the same kind of typed experience here. So that's important to mention, of course. And then there's a bunch of other things that you can do here, around using query parameters and updating the URL without triggering re-rendering and those types of things. But we don't have to cover those now. I guess we're kind of running a little bit low on the time we set. So do you have any other questions for this segment?
So I feel like we just went through the whole router and everything, and it's trying to think. So is using this router, is that directly connected to using Vite, or are you able to use something like Parcel or Webpack?
It is currently connected to using Vite. But there's no as long as you're not trying to cram it into a framework, it's probably doable to port it to, because it's not that much code that the router itself is outside of generating route stuff. So you could probably port it to something else, but right now it's about using about Vite then.
I'm fine with that. I like Vite for everything. So it's just I don't see any other point using anything else these days. Really. But
I mean, if this is purely a consequence of me being a single person doing this mostly for my own use cases. So if there was a big use case for using it with Parcel and demand for that, you could probably make that work. So it's not a matter of it not working. It's more a matter of it just not being a priority right now.
Gotcha. Because I think the lift to go to something like Parcel or Webpack is really, it's making things more dynamic and client side, I guess. Yeah, because those Parcel doesn't have any of the stuff that Vite does for all the magic it does. It's more of just a load my scripts.
But it's fast. Which is nice. I think Parcel
is very fast. Parcel Parcel is still I will reach to it if I don't want to configure anything. You can just npx Parcel, point it at an index.html file, and you don't have to have any configs. You don't have to install anything. It's just there, and then you can just import ESM. You can just import type module. Now you're running a React, Vue, Solid, whatever. It's just there, hot module reloading. But that's pretty much it. Right, you're not going to get SSR, or you're not going to get any kind of fancy plugins, but it installs plugins manually under the hood. So if it sees that you're importing a TypeScript file, it'll automatically install I need the TypeScript compiler, and it just does it. So it's zero config. You don't need to even install it. You can just say, I want you to load this HTML file and give me a hot module reloading, and then build a production version of this and bundle it. And that's it. That's what it does. It's really fast.
That's really useful though.
Fast. But if you just want to, not set up 800 lines of code or 13 config files to do something, it's very nice.
Yeah. I tried I used Parcel version 1, but that's ages ago. Obviously, I should try it again. Sometime soon.
It's all in Rust now, and there's a whole bunch of stuff they've done. To make it really fast.
Their lead developer is really good as well. So he usually does great stuff. So it'd be nice to check it out again.
They just And the Lightning CSS thing they have.
Oh yeah, that of
the
course.
CSS parts are written in Rust, and now Vite also supports as well. So
I actually tinkered with integrating that with ReScript, another thing I have for ReScript, where you can kind of embed other languages into ReScript. So like obviously this is an example of GraphQL, but you could essentially write that styles equals CSS, and then write CSS in here and get back a CSS modules compiled thing.
That would be cool.
And it would use Lightning CSS in the background to actually produce a minified and CSS moduled kind of CSS file that that you kind of need to import then yourself. Or I don't remember. Maybe I made that work. No, I made that work as well. I think that it all imports into your code as well.
Nice.
So it's kind of neat. Cool. I haven't gone around to finishing it, but it's part of a thing I've been working on for trying to embed languages into ReScript. Like EdgeQL is another thing, like EdgeDB, and also SQL. I have things for Postgres and EdgeDB as well, but in a way that's not very. You don't have to have a PPX for each one of those, and you don't have to block the render process or the compile process, because the compiler needs to go through itself and kind of process all of the code that you're doing. So this thing would have its own kind of compiler that would run whenever the CSS changes, and the ReScript compiler would only be responsible for switching this out to to-do list item CSS dot styles, for instance. That's all it does. And then the compiler produces this file. And the good part about that compared to the regular like PPX route is that this is fully like off thread, so to speak. Like this compiler, it never slows down your compilation process in ReScript itself, because generating, like, you're not going to change your CSS that often, and you don't need to regenerate it on every compilation. You just need to regenerate it whenever it changes. And whenever it changes, it's probably going to be fine that it takes a couple of milliseconds to regenerate it, because that's not going to be the big thing. So it's a way of keeping your compilation fast while still getting all of the goodies of embedding things.
Cool.
That was a sidetrack.
No, this is all like super awesome and super great. One thing I just want to, like, as we're wrapping up here, I just want to like touch on is to get all of this stuff, like the routing, the auto file generation. This is not like installing a whole bunch of like side things and setting up config files and npm installing like 20 packages.
Depends on what parts. Like, it's for the embedding language stuff, the idea is to make this
Sorry, I meant back to the router part.
Yeah.
Right. So for like this to-do fragment, like the fact that this is then getting that like use function down there. That's just part of RescriptRelay. Yeah. Which doesn't take long to configure and get that going.
No. We can look at this is good, because this is something that people it's kind of a misconception that it's very, very complicated to configure relay.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm getting at, is that like there's so much tooling that just seems to be happening here.
Yeah,
and I know that like if I was trying to do this with like TypeScript, I would be running code gen CLI, running it through. There would be and then I have like 13 Vite plugins to automatically run all these steps or something, where I'd be manually running it when I hit build.
Yeah. There's obviously a fair bit of configuration. I mean, it's hard to get around because you have a separate compiler for both the router and for Relay itself. But just starting with Relay then, we have the traditional like Relay packages, obviously. And we have RescriptRelay and ReScript stuff. Then you have a ReScript config file that points to where your code is, where the schema you have is, and where you want files to be generated, and then can do any like custom scalar mapping. And then inside of your package JSON, I typically set up a few like scripts. But for Relay, this is all there is. Like, you run the compiler, and then it works. And in configuring ReScript itself, you're passing the PPX flag and including that, but that's really it. There's nothing more to it. So so that's not too many steps, and more, like you can see, I have a bunch of dev things set up here that I run concurrently. And you're going to end up with that anyway. Like if you're doing anything more than just running the ReScript compiler, essentially, like I'm running Vite, so even without Relay, I would have a concurrent script here for both Vite and ReScript itself. There's a scenario where you could bake all of this into Vite plugins and have Vite control the processes of all of these. Like that could be a nice add-on. But as for Vite, then the router, you get a Vite plugin for the router itself, and you just pass that in here, and that's it. Like it just works. After that, you have the of course a small config file here as well, but outside of that, it works. So it's really not that much,
right? Like
but it's some.
The level of tooling generation of functions with types, right? It's like you're getting that create link function. You are getting that, like, just the fact that this component now knows what the shape, like it's this query graph. It's not just any query graph. You didn't have to, you didn't sit there anywhere in this file there. You're not like defining what is the type of a
exactly,
right? It's like you're not sitting there like I've tried to use like Relay with like TypeScript, and it is so painful
because you got to wire it all up.
You're sitting there having to wire it all up, and then like you can like set up like GraphQL code gen to look at your like a GraphQL schema and generate like types from it, and there's ways you can do all this stuff, but I have never managed to get it to a point where you can scale it to like really feeling like something you'd want to use in production. Like, oh, it works great for a day, but then it just falls apart because somebody didn't config right, or you got to remember to run this step, and it can get very complex very, very fast.
That's kind of what I mean with the constant pain kind of thing, that you set all of these things up, but they are all like this, because I very much know what you're talking about. It's a pain because having to wire things up manually means you need to understand that there are actual files generated from that you need to wire up the types from, and what those types are going to be called and stuff like that. So I've been very mindful in trying to avoid that as much as possible. So just like you say, there are no type definition or annotations here at all. Even this little key that you're passing in to get your fragment data is inferred for you automatically. You don't have to think about that more than that. You're passing this into the use function and you get data back, essentially. And these things are really important. And one of the main reasons I started with ReScript, or what was then called RescriptRelay back in the day, just that I saw that I could provide a better experience than I was used to I was using Flow at that point. I haven't used TypeScript with ReScript with Relay super much, but some I have. It was Flow back in the day for me.
Still is.
Still is. Okay, cool.
It's still TypeScript.
But like Flow, they've interestingly, if you use Relay with Flow, they have built into the Flow type checker that you don't have to explicitly annotate or pull in generated types. But that's because it's Facebook, and Facebook has both Flow and so they built it in.
Because Facebook is still using Flow. I think internally, it's never clear
more than ever.
Actually, okay. Because sometimes everything is Flow. Okay.
More or less, from what I understood.
Awesome.
One last thing to show here now we're starting to get into ReScript. Also, we gotta wrap this up as well. One last thing, we have a bunch of things to talk about the next time with like RescriptRelay, for instance, and all of the tooling around that. We didn't more than touch on that, but one final thing about the router is that it's built also to let you control how you want data and code, if you want data and code to be preloaded from the route itself.
Nice.
So you could say here, for instance, that, see if we get some completion in here. We don't. That you jump into it. Look here, preload mode. When you want to preload stuff, like, do you want to have no preloading? Do you want to preload on render? Do you want to preload on intent, which is when you kind of hover over it? Or do you want to preload when a link is in view? So it's really easy to kind of prepare things. And I have an application built with all of this that feels really fast, even though the data layer is quite slow. And that's because it preloads most things on intent. So as soon as you hover a link, it preloads the data for it and the code.
Mhm.
So whenever you also then navigate to the link, it'll all be instant essentially because it's already loaded. And most of the customers in that product are like use the product like, okay, I go to this link and I think a little bit about it, and then yes, that's where I want to click, and they click. So it's all done like when they click already,
Yeah.
which is nice.
Very nice.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good stop for the first session.
Yeah, I think this is good. We got through the router, kind of the general setup,
Yeah.
what relay is, and then we can come back again and go through more of the specifics of what's actually happening inside of these queries and the GraphQL side of it, and more the relay side of it, not just the router. But this is a great starting point.
And build, we can build a few views from scratch essentially and stuff like that as well.
This is all very, very exciting stuff. It's really cool to see all this in action.
I'm very glad that you took your time to listen to me.
Oh, this is great. This is great. I feel like I gained more information than if I just tried to go and dig through the source files or examples. It's like, okay, like seeing, like being able to see like the IDE, like the autocomplete and what happens on hover. Like that's all super awesome to see.
Yeah. It's a very fun like project, all of this, because you get to think so much about the developer experience kind of, which is hard but also very rewarding when you make things work in a good way. So it's very fun. I look forward to continuing it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
awesome.
Thank you for today.
Yeah, thanks for walking through this with me. This was great.
Yeah.
I'm excited to come back to this.
Yeah. We'll see when we get down to the next session then.
All righty.
Well, thank you very much. I'll stop the recording here.
Perfect. All right.